You've felt it, haven't you? That moment when desire floods through your body and immediately, almost simultaneously, another voice rises inside you. Not the voice of pleasure, but the voice of judgment. The prosecutor. The one that asks, is this normal? Is this acceptable? Should I be wanting this? And suddenly what began as a simple bodily sensation becomes a courtroom drama, where you are simultaneously the accused, the prosecutor, and the judge. You're lying there, or sitting there, or standing there, and instead of simply feeling what you feel, you're analyzing it, categorizing it, measuring it against invisible standards you never consciously chose. Where did that voice come from? Who taught you to police your own desire? And here's the really disturbing question. What if that surveillance, that constant monitoring of your own wanting, isn't protecting you at all? What if it's the very mechanism through which power enters your most intimate spaces, your most private moments, and controls you from the inside out? What I'm going to show you today will fundamentally change how you understand the relationship between your desire, your freedom, and the invisible forces that shape who you think you are. Because the truth is, your sexual desire doesn't just reveal what you want, it reveals who's really in control. We live in a strange paradox. We are told we live in an age of sexual liberation, an era where we can finally express our desires freely, without shame or constraint. The old repressive structures have supposedly fallen away. We can explore, experiment, discover ourselves. And yet, if you pay attention to your actual experience, something doesn't add up. Because alongside this apparent freedom, there's an unprecedented level of anxiety about sex. We worry constantly about whether we're normal, whether we're doing it right, whether our desires are healthy or unhealthy, empowering or problematic, aligned with our values or evidence of our damage. We consume endless content about sexuality, endless advice, endless frameworks for understanding what we should want and how we should want it. We've gone from a world where sex was hidden and forbidden to a world where sex is everywhere, and yet somehow we feel more confused, more monitored, more uncertain than ever. Think about how you actually experience desire in your daily life. Let's say you feel attracted to someone. What happens next? If you're like most people, you don't simply feel the attraction. You immediately begin to analyze it. You ask yourself questions. Is this appropriate? What does this say about me? Should I act on this? Is this attraction politically correct? Psychologically healthy? Spiritually evolved? You might worry that your desire is too conventional or not conventional enough. You might feel guilty for wanting something you've been told you shouldn't want, or inadequate for not wanting something you've been told you should want. You might find yourself performing desire rather than experiencing it, trying to embody what a sexually liberated person is supposed to look and feel like. And here's where it gets really interesting. Most people assume that this internal dialogue, this constant self-monitoring, is something they're doing to themselves. They think it's their own voice, their own conscience, their own values. They believe they are freely choosing to evaluate their desires according to standards they've rationally adopted. But what if that's not true at all? What if that voice isn't really yours? What if it's the internalized whisper of a system of power that has learned to operate not through external force, but through your own self-surveillance? This is where Michel Foucault's insights become absolutely crucial. Foucault spent much of his life studying how power actually works, and what he discovered was revolutionary. He showed that modern power doesn't primarily operate through prohibition and repression, it operates through production and normalization. Let me explain what this means in terms of your sexual desire. The old model of power, which most people still assume is how power works, functioned through saying, no, don't do that. That's forbidden, that's sinful, that's illegal. And certainly that kind of prohibitive power still exists. But Foucault discovered something far more sophisticated at work in modern societies. Modern power doesn't just tell you what not to do, it tells you what to be. It doesn't just repress your sexuality, it produces it. It creates entire frameworks through which you understand what sexuality even is, what's normal and abnormal, healthy and unhealthy, natural and unnatural. And the genius of this system is that it makes you into the agent of your own control. You become the one who monitors yourself, judges yourself, shapes yourself according to these norms. You do to yourself what power used to have to do to you from the outside. Consider the explosion of discourse about sexuality over the past century. We've gone from a culture that largely refused to speak about sex to one that won't shut up about it. Psychology, psychiatry, medicine, self-help, education, media, they all have endless things to say about what sexuality is and how it should function. They've created thousands of categories for classifying sexual behavior and desire. They've established norms for what healthy sexuality looks like at every age and stage. They've medicalized and pathologized countless forms of desire, creating not just prohibitions, but identities. And here's the critical insight. This isn't liberation. This is a new, more subtle form of power. Because when you internalize all these categories, all these norms, all these expectations, you begin to monitor yourself constantly. You become your own prison guard. You don't need external authorities to tell you what's acceptable anymore because you've absorbed their standards so deeply that you police yourself automatically, unconsciously, continuously. The question, is my desire normal, is not a question you're freely choosing to ask. It's a question that's been planted in you by a system of power that operates precisely through making you question yourself, measure yourself, adjust yourself to fit within acceptable parameters. Think about how this plays out in your actual life. You experience a sexual fantasy, perhaps something that doesn't fit neatly into the scripts you've been given for what acceptable desire should look like. What happens? You might feel a flash of shame, a sense that something is wrong with you. You might try to push the thought away, to deny it, to convince yourself you didn't really feel what you felt. Or you might do something equally revealing. You might go online and search for information about whether this fantasy is normal. You might read articles, watch videos, scan forums, trying to determine whether other people have similar desires, whether experts consider it healthy, whether it's something you should work to eliminate, or something you should embrace. And notice what's happening in this process. You're not simply experiencing your desire. You're submitting it to a vast apparatus of judgment, classification, and normalization. You're trying to figure out which category you fit into, which identity you belong to, whether you're acceptable or need to be fixed. And the entire time you believe you're engaged in a process of self-discovery, of getting to know yourself better. But Foucault would ask, are you discovering yourself, or are you producing yourself according to pre-existing templates? Are you finding out who you really are, or are you learning to recognize yourself only through the categories that power has made available? And more fundamentally, who benefits from this constant self-examination? The answer might surprise you. What benefits is not you, not your freedom, not your pleasure, but a system that requires you to be constantly worried about whether you're normal, constantly anxious, about whether you're doing it right, constantly seeking expert validation for your own desires, a system that keeps you focused inward on managing your own sexuality rather than outward on questioning the very frameworks through which sexuality itself is understood and controlled. Now I want to tell you about something Foucault called the confession. For centuries, Western culture has had a peculiar obsession with getting people to talk about their sexuality, to confess their desires, to speak their truth. This started in religious contexts, where you had to tell a priest about your sexual thoughts and acts. But it didn't stay there. It spread into medicine, where you had to tell a doctor, into psychology, where you had to tell a therapist, into everyday life, where you're expected to tell partners, friends, even strangers online about your sexual history, your preferences, your identity. And we've been taught to believe that this speaking, this confession is liberating, that by talking about our sexuality, by bringing it out of the shadows, we free ourselves from repression. But Foucault saw something different. He saw that confession is a technology of power. Every time you confess your desires to someone, every time you speak your sexuality into existence through the available categories and frameworks, you're not escaping power. You're entering more deeply into its mechanisms. Because confession requires an authority, someone who listens, interprets, judges, validates or invalidates. Someone who tells you what your confession means, what you really are, what you should do about it, and in the process of confessing, you learn to see yourself through their eyes. You internalize their frameworks for understanding sexuality. You begin to narrate your own experience using their categories, their language, their assumptions. You start to believe that your truth can only be spoken in the terms they've provided. Think about contemporary culture's obsession with coming out, with declaring your sexual identity, with being visible and legible. On one level, this represents real progress, real resistance against historical oppression, but on another level, Foucault would ask us to notice how this too can become a mechanism of power. Because declaring an identity, fitting yourself into a recognized category, making yourself legible to systems of knowledge, these acts don't simply free you. They also capture you within specific frameworks for understanding who you can be. They create new norms, new expectations, new ways you're supposed to perform your identity correctly. And before we go further, I need to pause here and ask you something directly. Have you ever felt trapped by your own desire? Not trapped by acting on it, but trapped by having it at all? Have you ever wished you could just want different things, simpler things, more acceptable things? Because I know that when you're going through this, when you're lying awake at night wondering why you can't just be normal, why you can't just want what everyone else seems to want, it feels completely isolating. It feels like there's something uniquely wrong with you, like you're the only person in the world who struggles with this particular configuration of desire and shame. But here's what I need you to know. You're not alone. Thousands of people watching this right now are carrying the exact same weight. They're policing their desires the same way you are. They're performing the same internal trials, the same endless self-interrogations. And you know what helps? More than any theory or framework, simply knowing that other people understand. So scroll down to the comments and write this: I police my own desire too. That's it. You don't need to explain anything. You don't need to confess details. Just that one sentence, because when you write it, you're not just acknowledging your own experience. You're telling someone else who reads your comment that they're not alone either, and that might be exactly what someone desperately needs to hear today. So what does liberation actually look like in this context? And here's where we have to be very careful, because Foucault is not offering you a simple solution. He's not saying there's a true, authentic, natural sexuality buried underneath all these layers of social control that you just need to uncover. That idea, that notion of discovering your real sexual self, is itself part of the apparatus of power he's describing. The modern obsession with finding your true sexual identity, with expressing your authentic desires, is not an escape from the systems of control we've been discussing. It's often another way they operate. The system doesn't need to repress you anymore. It just needs to keep you endlessly searching for your true self, endlessly confessing and examining and adjusting, endlessly consuming expertise about who you really are. What Foucault offers instead is something more challenging and more genuinely liberating. He invites you to recognize that you are not discovering yourself. You are creating yourself. There is no fixed essential sexual identity waiting to be found. There are only the practices, the relationships, the experiments through which you bring yourself into being. And the crucial question is not whether these practices express your true nature, but whether they expand your freedom or constrain it, whether they open up new possibilities for existing or close them down, whether they're chosen from a place of creativity and agency, or from a place of conformity to norms you've internalized without realizing it. This means asking different questions about your desire, not, is this normal, but does this create the kind of life I want to live? Not, what does this say about my identity, but what does this make possible or impossible for me? Not, should I accept or fight this desire, but what relationship do I want to have with my own wanting? These are harder questions because they don't have expert answers. No therapist, no self-help book, no online forum can tell you whether a particular desire creates freedom or constraint in your specific life. Only you can figure that out through the actual living of it, through experimentation and attention and honest reflection. Foucault introduces us to this concept he calls practices of freedom. These are ways of relating to yourself and your desires that don't aim to discover your true nature or conform to external norms, but rather to create yourself as a work of art. Imagine approaching your sexuality not as something you need to get right, not as something that reveals your fixed identity, but as a creative practice, something you shape and craft and experiment with throughout your life. This doesn't mean anything goes, that all desires are equal, that there are no ethical considerations. Quite the opposite. It means taking full ethical responsibility for the life you're creating through your choices, rather than outsourcing that responsibility to experts who tell you what's normal or healthy or appropriate. It means asking whether your sexual practices, whatever they are, contribute to relationships of mutual freedom or relationships of domination, whether they open up possibilities for growth and connection or close them down, whether they're expressions of creativity and care or patterns of compulsion and harm. And here's the challenging part. You can't answer these questions once and for all. You have to keep asking them, keep experimenting, keep adjusting, because you're not a fixed thing that can be finally figured out. You're an ongoing project, a constant becoming. And the goal is not to achieve some final, correct version of yourself, but to live in such a way that you're continuously creating new possibilities for who you can be. This requires tremendous courage, because it means giving up the false security of believing there's a right answer, a correct identity, a normal way to be. It means accepting the anxiety and responsibility of freedom, of recognizing that you are the author of your own life in ways that are both exhilarating and terrifying. Let me tell you about someone I know. Let's call her Maya. Maya spent most of her 20s trying to figure out her sexual orientation. She dated men, dated women, read endless articles about bisexuality and pansexuality and fluidity. She joined online communities, went to therapy, tried to find the right label that would finally explain who she was. And the whole time, she was miserable. Because no matter which identity she claimed, it never quite fit. There was always some part of her experience that didn't match the definition, always some desire that didn't align with the category. She felt like she was failing at being herself, like everyone else had successfully figured out who they were, and she was somehow broken for not being able to do the same. Then something shifted. She stopped asking, "What am I?" and started asking, "What do I want to create?" She stopped trying to find herself and started building a life. She chose partners based not on whether they confirmed her identity, but on whether the relationship opened up new possibilities for both of them. She stopped confessing her desires to experts and started paying attention to what actually brought her joy, connection, growth. She gave up on being legible, on fitting into recognizable categories, and embraced being a mystery even to herself. And for the first time, she felt free, not because she'd finally discovered her true nature, but because she'd stopped looking for it. She'd accepted that she was a project, not a discovery, a question, not an answer, a creative practice, not a fixed identity. If you've made it this far in this video, I want to acknowledge something important. You're not here just looking for information. You're here because you recognize that something about the way we understand desire, the way we relate to our own sexuality, doesn't quite work. You're tired of the endless self-monitoring, the constant anxiety about whether you're normal, the feeling that your desire is something to be managed rather than lived. And I want you to know that you don't have to navigate this alone. This channel exists for people like you, people who want to go deeper than surface-level answers, who are willing to question everything they've been taught about who they should be. Every week I explore these kinds of questions, using philosophy and critical thinking to understand the mechanisms of power that shape our lives from the inside. If you want to continue this journey of genuine liberation, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Not because I need the numbers, but because you deserve a space where you can think differently about yourself and your life. And if this video gave you a new way of seeing your own experience, leave a like so more people who are struggling with these same questions can find their way here. We're building something together, a community of people who refuse easy answers and are willing to do the hard work of creating themselves freely. What I'm describing here is not a technique you can master. It's an orientation you can adopt, an ongoing practice of questioning the frameworks through which you understand yourself rather than just questioning yourself within those frameworks. It means noticing when you're judging your desires according to internalized norms and asking where those norms came from, who they serve, whether they actually align with the kind of life you want to create. It means recognizing that the voice in your head that says, this isn't normal, or you should want something different, isn't necessarily your voice at all. It might be the voice of power operating through you, a mechanism of social control that's become so internalized you mistake it for your own conscience. And the practice of freedom involves creating distance from that voice, not to silence it entirely, because it contains important information about the world you live in, but to stop treating it as the ultimate authority on who you should be. This work is ongoing because power is ongoing. The systems that produce normalized sexuality, that create categories and hierarchies of acceptable desire, they don't stand still. They evolve, adapt, find new ways to operate. Liberation in one era can become a new form of control in the next. What was transgressive becomes commodified. What was liberating becomes obligatory. What was a refusal of categories becomes a new set of categories. So the practice of freedom can never be finished, can never be secured once and for all. It requires constant vigilance, constant questioning, constant willingness to examine even your most cherished beliefs about yourself. And look, I know this is hard. I know there's a part of you that wishes I would just give you a simple answer, a clear framework, a definitive guide to understanding your desire correctly. But that wish itself, that desire for an external authority to tell you who you are and what you should want, that's part of what keeps you trapped. Real liberation doesn't come from finding better authorities to obey or better categories to fit into. It comes from accepting the burden and the gift of creating yourself, from recognizing that you are both the question and the answer, both the artist and the artwork. Your sexual desire doesn't reveal who you really are in some fixed, essential sense. It reveals the ongoing work of becoming, the constant negotiation between your body, your history, your relationships, your culture, and your choices. It reveals the traces of power that have shaped you and the possibilities for reshaping yourself. It reveals that you are not a thing to be discovered, but a project to be undertaken, not a truth to be confessed, but a life to be created. And when you really understand this, when feel it not just intellectually but in your bones, something extraordinary happens. The question stops being, is my desire normal, and becomes, what do I want to make of this desire? The question stops being, what does this say about my identity, and becomes, what kind of life am I building? The question stops being who's in control and becomes, how can I create more freedom for myself and others through the choices I make? This shift doesn't make everything easy. It doesn't eliminate anxiety or confusion, but it transforms them from signs that something is wrong with you into signs that you're alive, engaged in the ongoing work of creating yourself. And that's not a problem to be solved. That's the human condition to be lived, with courage, with creativity, with care for yourself and others, with the recognition that you are always more than any category, any identity, any definition could capture. You are a mystery unfolding, a question without a final answer, a freedom that can never be fully secured but must be continuously practiced. And that's not a limitation. That's your power. That's your possibility. That's where your real liberation begins.